when we came in, we were discussing the popularity of Paul Nash as an Oxford artist. And we had a little wager, a very little wager, on a response from you. And I'd like you to answer this question as honestly as you possibly can. How many of you had actually heard of Paul Nash before you came along to tonight's session? If you could just raise a hand, please. I think I'll win, Morris. You win. Splendid. Well, that actually makes things a lot easier for me. Because I'm working with known quantities. When we talk about Paul Nash in Oxford, we are specifically talking about the Second World War. And one of the reasons I got interested in him initially was that I am of that generation. I was one of the kids that were brought up in the late 40s, early 50s, just after the Second World War. And I think it's fair to say that everybody in the community that I lived knew something about the Second World War because they had been directly involved in it. I had uncles who served in the Navy. My father served in the Army. I had cousins who were in the Air Force. And then there was that groundswell of knowledge that existed already. In fact, my father was very instrumental in this because he told me lots of stories about things that he had done in the war. And he'd been in a variety of places, including France and Belgium, Palestine. But for a 10-year-old in short trousers, it was all very confusing because there were so many stories from different places, different people, different contexts. And it really didn't begin to make sense to me as an event until he showed me a particular picture. Morris, slide 1. And this is the picture he showed me. It's Paul Nash's representation of the Battle of Britain. And the message that came across to me, quite sort of overtly, was that this, and from him specifically, was that the difference between this war, or the Second World War, and the wars in the past, was that it was principally fought in the air. The air was a major factor in the outcome of the war. And for me, as a small boy, this was fascinating. It's fascinating principally because I'd always been interested in aeroplanes, but it's fascinating as well because Paul Nash, likewise, had always had a fascination with aircraft. And it was one of his aspirations all through his life to actually fly. He never actually managed to get around to doing that, but it was something that he aspired to. So, who was Paul Nash? Well, by the time he painted this picture, he was probably one of the most well-known artists in Britain. He had been a war artist in the First World War, and in the second, between the First and the Second Wars, the 1930s, he was one of the leaders of the avant-garde, particularly in terms of painting surrealism. So, in many ways, this story about the air and about aeroplanes and about Paul Nash, and, as I hope I'm going to show you, Oxford itself, is one of the same story. Here he is. This is Paul Nash at the time, in two times of his life. The first in his late 20s, I think, and the picture on the left there, if you see him in the rather sort of 21st century haircut, he was in his late 20s, and that time he was a second lieutenant in the Hampshire Regiment. He had a very sort of checkered First World War experience. He joined up, as I say, when he was 27, and he joined the Artist Rifles to begin with, and unsurprisingly, being an artist. And for much of the early part of the war, he spent time in Britain. He didn't actually see active service until 1917, when he was sent out to Ypres in Belgium. And that was a particularly significant time, because in 1917, in Ypres, there were preparations being made for the major offensive that would win the war. one of the many. And this was the Battle of Passchendaele. And the Hampshire Regiment and Nash were out there preparing for this. And it was one of the sort of idiosyncrasies of war that changed everything for him. Because while out on a night patrol, he fell into his trench and broke a rib. It was a rib, wasn't it? Yes, it was a rib. I'm a little bit nervous, ladies and gentlemen, because I'd have 3 experts here on full Nash sitting in my immediate left, which is why I've sort of inclined myself away from them, hoping that if I do make a major gaffe, I won't see them blanching. Anyway, I press on regardless. Anyway, this lucky accident for Nash meant that he was sent back to Britain with a blighty one, and was recovering when one of the forerunning engagements that led up to Passchendaele, what was become known as the seizing of Hill 60, was undertaken by the Hampshire Regiment, and many of the officers in that regiment were killed at the time. I don't know whether this was a sort of warning to Nash, but he was even more determined at that time to actually become a war artist and thus avoid having to go through all the trials and tribulations of horror warfare. And because he was very well connected, and even by this time he was becoming a very well-known artist, he managed to get a role as an official war artist and returned to Passchendaele. Okay, when he returned, of course he missed the battle. Let's face it, that was no great miss. But Nash was principally a landscape artist, and he loved trees and nature and the whole landscape panorama. And what he saw at Passchendaele was a horror show. It was a completely devastated landscape. And what he painted was a reflection of the horror and the dismay that he felt at seeing this blighted landscape. Of course, we remember the people, and the stories that have come down about the First World War is principally about the people. But for Nash, it was the horror of the devastated landscape that affected him also. And this is one of his most famous pictures from the First War, called the Menin Road. And it shows that devastated landscape. He had a philosophical approach to this as well. And what he wanted to do was to get the message back home of the horror that he was experiencing. And he actually wrote that, and I quote here, in this landscape, he wanted to help rob war of the last shred of glory and the last shine of glamour. So that's where he was at the end of the First World War. Could we go back to the previous one, Rose? Okay, so that's where he was at the end of the First War. And at the beginning of the Second, he was a very different man. The First War had actually taken its toll. He suffered from bouts of depression in the 1920s, which were diagnosed as war strain, and increasing poor health brought about bronchial asthma in the 1930s. Despite this, he still achieved the highest echelons in British art. It was unsurprising, therefore, that with his World War I achievements as a war artist, that in September 1939, he was approached by the rather Orwellian title of the Ministry of Education, which was really a sort of guise for the Ministry of Propaganda, to become an official war artist. The Ministry of Information introduced this scheme principally because they wanted artists to be recorders of events and show British troops in a positive light. In fact, what they wanted to show was the British troops taking the war to Hitler. Because most of you know, things didn't go particularly well for Britain at the beginning of the war. And every effort was being made to try and boost morale amongst the civilian populations. So there wasn't a shortage of artists who were looking out for this work, any sort of work, in fact, because it was a time when artists weren't in great demand. So let's have a look at one of these artists. Here she is. This is an unusual photo in many ways because it shows an artist actually in the field doing what artists do, painting a rather sort of devastated bomb site there. The war artist scheme, as it became, had two principal objectives. First of all, it was to keep an on-the-spot record, and you can see Ethel Gabain here is actually just turned up after an air raid and is painting a picture of what she's seeing. The point behind this was that what the artists did, they didn't actually just have a photographic image. What they created was a feel for the event. And what the Ministry of Information wanted was people to get not only an accurate perspective, but to get emotionally engaged in what was happening as well. The second thing was they wanted to use it as propaganda. They wanted to show what was happening to this country. And this particular air raid was one that was called terrific devastation. And of course, that's the message they want to get across. Now, I think the propaganda element can be seen by the composition of this photograph. Ethel Gabain there is being looked admiringly on by two schoolboys, all three perched rather precariously on roof timbers. But at least the boys have been given a mattress to sit on. And Ethel herself is in a two-piece suit, woolen stockings and heeled shoes. She looks anything but comfortable. And anything like a war artist, really. It's a strongly artificial image. It's an artist clearly not in harmony with her environment. She looks almost superimposed. And it reminded me of another more famous picture. This man, one of some of you might recognise, is John Ruskin. He was the most famous writer and authority on art in the Victorian period and responsible for the pre-Raphaelite movement. So he's got a lot to answer for. So, sorry about that. Raphaelites, lovers here. At the time of this painting by John Millet, and John Millet at the time was rather preoccupied in a different way as he was sort of running off with Ruskin's wife. But, you know, that's what happened in Victorian art. And he started this picture while they were all on holiday together in Scotland. Ruskin venerated nature and asked to be painted in it. Now, of course, this picture is a fantasy by Millet. This is a man in, or rather on, nature, rather than of nature. And it's a bit of a dig at Millet. Like Ethel Gabain, Ruskin is in his fine clothes and seems to be superimposed on the setting. There's a man superimposed on one environment. Could you go back to the previous one, Morris? Sorry about that. I'm not cueing you in well, am I? Sorry.
No, we'll get that.
So, like Ruskin's photograph, this is another contrived image that has been put there for a specific purpose. So, at the end of 1939, less than 4 months after the war started, a committee was formed. Of course it was. And there's going to be lots of committees and lots of acronyms in this talk, but I'll try and keep it to the minimum. Because the acronym for this group is the War Artists Advisory Committee. The War Artists Advisory Committee, which are called WAC. So if you don't remember any of the acronyms, if you remember that one, you're doing very well. It was made up of several eminent artists and many representatives of the armed forces, from the Army, the Navy and the Air Force, all under the auspices of the Ministry of Information, the Ministry of Propaganda. So there were very different people on board here. It was never going to be easy. But it was headed up by this man. And here he is, Sir Kenneth Clarke. You might recognise the face, particularly as I see there's dancing among you, there's quite a few people with the same colour hair as me. In the 1960s, he was dubbed Lord Clerk of Civilization by Private Eye. You might remember he ran a series in 1969 called Civilization, which defined for anybody who knew nothing about art or nothing about culture, what civilization was, and it was in 12 riveting episodes. Actually, I watched it quite recently, it's not bad. But he was the doyen of art. He was the big mover and shaker. And he wanted to find work for artists when there really wasn't much work around. And he was a great supporter of modern British artists. But in a way, this wasn't his only reason. He knew that in the First War, many aspiring young artists had died. And what his aim was to keep them going. So by forming WAC, the idea was that they would become official war artists and go wherever the fighting was, wherever the action was, and they would report and present positive propaganda that could then be fed back to the great British public. And he was the man to do it. He had all the qualities that you needed. He was incredibly young to get this role. He actually became in charge of the National Gallery in the mid-30s. He was only 36 when the war broke out, and he had been knighted at the age of 35. So, you know, the boy was a social climber of a major aspiring type. And he was friend of everybody, the great and the good. The King and the Queen were personal friends, as was Neville Chamberlain, the Prime Minister. He knew everybody. And he was also, for our purposes and the purpose of this story, he was the chairman of WAC. So, Clark felt that the war created opportunities for expression and sentiment and comment. The 20th century artist would be experiencing the war, and he would be telling the great British public what was going on through their art. But he wanted people to understand art as well. On top of everything else, he believed his role was an educational one, and this is fascinating. But what complicates is sitting around the table of the War Artists Advisory Committee were Kenneth Clark and several eminent artists, but also representatives of the Army, the Air Force and the Navy. And they had a very different view about what art was about. The only justification was that it provided suitable propaganda. And I think we have to think whether there's a tension between art and propaganda. Can it be both? Is there a good propaganda and a bad propaganda? Images that try to tell the truth against images that try to deceive? Now, the Ministry of Information was aware of it. And the British artist, in Clark's view, was going to war against fascism. The values espoused in the images that these British artists would be creating could be interpreted as work by free artists, whereas Joseph Goebbels' Nazi Minister of Propaganda was designed to deceive and distort. It was a war for civilization. For this reason, Clark decided that only the very best British artists should become war artists. And we're just going to look at a few. Here's one of my favourites. This is Stanley Spencer. And in 1940, he was about 50, and he's sporting his characteristic long fringe and glasses. Like Nash, Spencer had served in the First World War as an official war artist on the Balkan front, but he was the personification of the eccentric and idiosyncratic English artist, a man of unusual vitality and energy, and an extraordinary original talent. And despite a disastrous private life, he had an insatiable curiosity and affection for people. And it's people that dominate his greatest canvases. Now, in 1940, Stanley was sent by WW2 to Port Glasgow on the Clyde to record the activities of shipbuilders. Now, in 1940, the Clyde was a hive of industry. And what they wanted to do was to bring to public attention the importance of ships and showing shipbuilders at work. And Stanley got down to detail right away by ingratiating himself with the workers. And what he would do is, when they were on their way to work, he had a toilet roll. And on that toilet roll, he would do little sketches of them. He would ask them to stand still for 15 to 20 seconds, and he'd do a quick thumbnail, and he would give them the toilet, turn off the toilet paper and give it to them. The workers at Clyde were rather bemused by this. These were these were Glaswegians from working class backgrounds. But like all eccentrics, he did seem to ingratiate himself to them. And what he started to produce was very large canvases showing the Clyde workers doing their business. I'm just going to quote a little bit here from Stanley's diary. And he writes this: "I soon found that the shipyard of Port Glasgow is only one aspect of life there. There were rows of men and women hurrying in the streets, or standing or leaning with their backs against them, and early shoppers going to and fro. I saw children lying on the ground, using the road as their drawing board, and making drawings in coloured chalk. All of this seemed to me to be full of some inward surging meaning, a kind of joy that I longed to get closer to and understand and in some way fulfil." Well, there's a lovely sentiment, but Port Glasgow during the war was not a place of great harmony or even cooperation. In March 1941, the Luftwaffe staged a massive bombing attack on the area. 16,000 houses were destroyed and 35,000 people were made homeless. And there were also strikes, industrial action, 1943 being a particularly bad one for Clyde. However, of course, this wasn't the story that the Minister of Information wanted telling. And in his own idiosyncratic style, Stanley Spencer told the more positive version. Another artist whose work was sought after was the sculptor Henry Moore. In 1940, when this picture was taken, Moore was possibly, with the exception of Barbara Hepworth, the best known sculptor in Britain. What wasn't very well known, that he was also particularly good at two-dimensional work as well. And he was sent to the London Underground during the air raids, and using the medium of notebook and pencil, he sketched people on the crowded platforms on the underground stations. And again, he writes of this: "Then the air raids began, and the war, from being an awful worry, started to become a real experience. Quite against what I expected, I found myself strangely excited by the bomb buildings, but more still by the unbelievable scenes of life and the underground shelters. I began filling a notebook with drawings, ideas based on shelter life. Naturally, I could not draw inside the shelter itself. I drew from memory, and on my return home. But the scenes of the shelter world, static figures, asleep, reclining figures, remained vivid in my mind. I felt somehow drawn to it all. Here was something I couldn't help doing." And this is just one example of a brief sketch that he'd done and worked up back in the studio. And they are remarkable images, and still some of the most sought after paintings of the Second World War. The WW2 and the general public were very taken by their quality. they were surprised actually by the humanity that Moore shown, because he was considered a rather sort of remote and cold and functional artist. And it seemed to be almost becalming with a city that's been torn about by destruction and chaos to have these images on show to the public. And Kenneth Clark was very keen to make sure that happened. The third member of the Big Four was a rising star in the firmament, Graham Sutherland. Although in his late 30s, he'd already had a full career. He'd been an engineer and an architect and been a designer in china and glass and fabrics. And unlike Spencer and Moore, Sutherland's interest principally lay in landscape, and he was sent to go into the cities where war damage had taken place, and he contrived to make some remarkable images of that, as well as going to the quarries, and this is something he opted to do personally. And he created images that showed people, men working in quarries, and the sort of grotesque shapes and landforms that came out of it became very popular. I suppose Sutherland these days is principally be remembered for the portrait painter who did a picture of Sir Winston Churchill that he didn't quite approve of, and the family eventually set fire to. And of course, there was his remarkable Christ the Redeemer in Coventry Cathedral. But I suppose those three artists and Paul Nash were the most significant painters. But before I go on to Nash, I'd just like to include one of my favourites. He's not in the same league as the Big Four, and he didn't produce work that was radically different, but he did produce the occasional spectacular one. And he shopped around to begin with to try and find somebody to adopt him as an artist. And as an official war artist, he was eventually taken up by the London Fire Brigade. And he took a particular interest in their work and the fantastic images that would be created every night as the Blitz hit London. And on one particular night, he produced what I think is one of the most remarkable images of the war. Now, Rosserman went out with the firemen during these events, and he actually witnessed this terrifying and tragic one, because what you've been shown here, ladies and gentlemen, is a moment of death. The two firemen are about to be crushed by the collapsing wall, and one of them died instantly. The other one, William Sanson, survived to tell the story. And Rosserman actually witnessed the event and was actually hit by flying debris as he saw this thing happen. But for me, and I'm just going to talk a little bit about art here, it's the composition and execution which are testimony to the heroism and altruism, not just of these two firemen, but the fire service in general. This is a composition of an inferno, in red and orange and yellow. You can almost feel the heat from the firestorm that is about to engulf the two firefighters. But the catastrophe of the collapsing wall cannot distract us from the two figures wrestling with the hose. You feel their tragedy in the same way that Rosserman did. And Morris is going to be very pleased with this, because I'm going to use my little marker here. There's a diagonal that runs almost from the bottom left to the top right of the picture. And in the top half here, you've got a completely abstract image. It's a sort of Dantean image of hell exploding and boiling and melting, whereas the lower diagonal shows the two figures about to meet their fate. Firemen had a special position amongst the civil services, and what many people don't know is that it was principally made up of volunteers. Now, when WAC discover this image and the images that Rosserman had been making, they started to show them in galleries around London. In 1941, for example, at Cooling Galleries, over 64,000 people in 1 month went to see the exhibitions. Kenneth Clark was cock-a-hoop. Whack pictures and artists began to tour the country. And the question is, was it promoting and propagandizing the war effort, or educating the general public as to art as a sort of cathartic activity? All of them, who knows? But what does it matter? Artists were playing their part, and this mattered a lot to one man. And here he is. This is Paul Nash, sketching outdoors, circa 1940. As I said before, when war broke out in 1939, Paul Nash had already become established as one of the most foremost artists in the avant-garde. He experimented in abstract art, became a pioneer of modernism. He concentrated particularly on landscape, and often putting sort of surreal features into familiar places in England. And this picture of him is very typical. What he sees and draws must be seen as the starting point of his imagination. They weren't the end, they were the beginning. At this time, Nash was resident in Hampstead, and he was actively painting and exhibiting and teaching very successfully. But during the 1930s, like most people, he noticed the sinister developments that were taking place in Britain. And being a famous artist and a famous modern artist, emigre artists from Europe started to pass his way, and he noticed that more and more of them, particularly from Eastern Europe, were passing through Hampstead, passing through London, and visiting him. And it wasn't just artists, it was philosophers, it was scientists. And these people were principally fleeing Germany, passing through Hampstead, often on their way to America. And Nash began to become very aware that there was great things happening afoot. In fact, what he saw, ladies and gentlemen, was that war was on its way. And the second part of this evening, I'll be looking at Nash and his work, and not a coincidence that the image he's using there of a huge hawk hovering is a creature of the air, because it's the air that will be the principal part of the second part of tonight's talk. It's time for a drink. The Nashes, the sort of doyen of the art circle in Hampstead, deciding that it's going to be a good idea to leave London, principally I think because Nash had a notion that much of the experience that British people would have of the Second War would revolve around the air and aircraft, and it would be a singularly dangerous place to be in the capital of Britain. So this quote from his autobiography outline, I think is a powerful and poetic statement, because he was obviously aware what was going to be happening, and he saw this nemesis that was on the horizon as this huge hawk hovering. A wonderful sort of alliteration, and it really sort of sums up the story from now on. The Nashes decided to leave London for Oxford, which they felt was a lot safer. Nash knew Oxford well. He'd had family connections here in his youth and had taught in the Ruskin School of Art from 1920 to 1923. So in 1939, in August 39, the Nashes pack their bags, leave London, and take rooms at the Randolph Hotel. See, I can't be funny in this.
Didn't say
They stayed in various places after that, in Beaumont Street and Holywell Street, and eventually took up residence at 106 Banbury Road, where the boot hack is today. Nash's feelings about the First War, and I was talking to a gentleman about this at a break, the anger, the frustration is probably too weak a word, that he felt towards the war were being resurrected now in the Second War. But he was a different man. He's now a man with status, he's a man with reputation, he's a man with authority. And Kenneth Clarke, the chairperson of WAC, recognised this, and he gave Nash his head to supervise. And Nash founded in Oxford the Arts Bureau for War Service. Now, this was rather a strange and sort of nebulous sort of organisation. We decided to get as many great and good in the art world together to pool their ideas and their talents, writers and painters and architects, musicians. So he got people along like Lord David Cecil, John Betjeman, John Piper came on board. But the problem was that there were so many, and it was so big and so cumbersome, and the intentions of it weren't very obvious, that in a way he was incapable of organising it. So Paul Nash rethought his position, and he wrote to his old friend Sir Kenneth Clarke, who was very good at finding jobs for artists. And he wrote to them, and this is one of the most strangest letters that he wrote, but I think it sort of sums up what was going on in Nash's head at the time. He asked Clarke if he could be given official facilities for recording monsters. I believe, he wrote, I could make something memorable. Monsters include tanks, aeroplanes, blimps, mechanical personages of all kinds. I see these things as the protagonists of war. This war will be a war of machines, and they have taken on a human and animal appearance. Technical-ish. Right. I'm really not sure what Kenneth Clarke made of this, but to his credit, he managed to secure Nash a commission in the Air Ministry. And it was here that Nash found his monsters. His monsters were crashed aeroplanes. There were plenty of these in 1940. The summer of 1940, as you all know, is best remembered for the Battle of Britain. Nash's monsters could now be found in every nook and cranny in the south of England. And here's one that came down in the cornfield. Nash at this time visited many airfields, and he was also sent photos of these monsters from the Air Ministry, and he transformed them into images in his own sort of idiosyncratic style. So you can see here, this is a surreal landscape, very similar to the sort of things he was producing in the 30s. It's iconic, with its blood red sun and its large, almost blackened trees, and you can barely see the bomber that has been swallowed up in the corn. It's almost as if it has been taken into the landscape itself. Another one, Raider on the Shore. Unsurprisingly, many wrecked aircraft littered the coasts, particularly the southern coast of Britain in the summer and autumn of 40. This image for Nash was a highly symbolic one, showing a wrecked hindquarter nesting as it does under the white cliffs of the Kent coast. This and its companion piece under the cliff, which shows the hindquarter's tail, are powerful propagandist images. They will be recognised by members of the general public as a statement, a warning to Nazi Germany. This barricade will not be breached. they shall not pass. The hoisting up of this down Messerschmitt must have provided Nash with a lot of food for thought. What happens to all these dead monsters? Where do they go? He was to find out the answer to that question sooner than he thought. He had given much time to thinking about British bomber planes, the ones that he was seeing now on a regular basis. And he produced an article, just a bit later, in 1942, called The Personality of Planes. And I'd just like to show you some of the planes he thought about. Now this is the Whitney bomber. Now he described it as a queer bird-like creature, reminding me of a dove of death. Can you see that? Did the dove of death come across to you at all? If you were the great British public, you would have been there, being influenced by Paul's writing and Paul's pictures. I'm not sure. Anyway, the next one, the Hamden, a bomber of a different shape and design. He described this as reptilian, a pterodactyl, a flying dinosaur. There's something, there's a bit sort of reptilian. I always think of pterodactyls a bit more sort of spiky and bony and bits jutting out of it. But anyway, that's Paul Nash's take. The Blenheim, probably one of the most common bombers that was used in the early part of the war. Now this is an interesting one because he described it as having a nose like a shark. I'm not too sure about that. But, it does have a sort of slightly sort of predatory look to it, don't you think? Come on, I'm voicing it for Paul. I'm selling you Paul Nash here, unsuccessfully, I think. Okay. The last one, the Wellington, and this is one that actually it's a photograph that Paul Nash took himself, and this look reminded him of a killer whale hunting in unknown seas. Yes, I think we're getting there. We're all into this idea. Thank you very much. Okay. But back to his paintings. Nash's imagination, as did his imagery, expanded the more he painted these planes. This dead monster is at a crazy angle, flipped over on its back, and its body parts littering the landscape. Shattered, lost limbs. And of course, I'm sure as many of you noticed, these are all pictures of German planes. And of course, there were many wrecked British planes around, but Nash was being seriously propagandist, deliberately so. And they struck a chord with whack. Clark wrote to Nash saying that his monsters were some of the best work he'd seen by war artists so far. However, the WAC committee were not unanimous. These images did not go down well with this man. And here he is, Air Commodore Harold Peake, the Air Ministry representative on WAC, and Nash's bête noire. He thoroughly and probably deliberately misunderstood Nash's work. In November 1940, he complained that Nash's pictures insulted the RAF. He felt the images showed the sordid side of aerial warfare rather than the valour and the heroism of the pilots. His objections were, as he put it, for the same reasons that pictures of horses are much more attractive to hunting men than pictures of a dead fox. You can get that, can't you? Yeah? It was no coincidence that Peake was the master of the Rufford Hounds. There were codes of gentlemanly conduct. Nash said, he made me feel that to make a picture of the wreck of an enemy machine on the ground was rather like shooting a sitting bird. Also, there were questions of representations. Nash foreshortened some aircraft parts and exaggerated others in the interest of composition. Flagrant misrepresentation, according to Peake. He insisted that Nash be removed from the Air Ministry salaried artist straight away. Clark appealed to the Air Ministry, but in vain. Clark wrote, "I told them how foolish they are, in very strong, almost insulting terms, but I'm afraid there were certain number of them, led by Peake, who yearn for the Royal Academic style, and they are determined to have it." Peake made sure that Nash never worked for the Air Ministry after December 1940. He was typical of a brand of upper-class military men who still saw war as cricket and dogfights as medieval jousts. Nash acknowledged that propaganda is going to have to be part of his role. And he wrote to Clark, "I'm face to face with that odious word, propaganda." Well, why not? It was used to deny that pictorial propaganda had immense possibilities. Nash was employed by the Air Ministry between March and December 1940, and this was the period that marked Britain, perhaps for Britain, was the greatest battle of the early war. It's one that we saw earlier, and you're quite right, Maurice, it's the Battle of Britain. He made this picture representing it in 1941 when he was no longer at the Air Ministry. It's iconic and much reproduced image, which showed action over southern Britain in the summer and autumn of 1940. And he actually painted it in Oxford. Actually, my friend Jan has confirmed that, so I can say that with all authority. I've never been able to find out, and he actually told me today it had been. So there we are. If it's wrong, Jan Cox. It has all the hallmarks of Paul Nash's surrealism, and it shows what's been called his aerial imagination. And I think when you look at the perspective of this, it could only be imagined from the position of being in the air, a position that Nash never actually had. Nash wrote of it, "Across the spaces of sky trails and aeroplanes, smoke tracks of dead and damaged machines, floating clouds, parachutes, balloons, against the approaching twilight, new formations of Luftwaffe threatening." And he was speaking in this sort of broken, poetic imagery. And in a way, that's what this picture is. It's a series of broken, poetic images. And it is best described, I think, as a skyscape or an airscape, a civilian's view of aerial combat. You can see quite clearly the vapour trails which make up the sort of major aerial part of the composition, and the squadrons of enemy aircraft. Use my pointer again here, ladies and gentlemen. There we are, the squadrons of enemy aircraft. The problem is when I use the pointer, I lose my track on this one, so I'm not sure if it's a good thing or not really. It's also remnants of barrage balloons, and it shows really it's not an actual place. It's an imagined notion of a battle. And there's one particular point I think that is absolutely fascinating, because if you notice, there's a lone plane here. A single plane has plummeted into the English Channel. And Kenneth Clark saw this as an allegory. I think it's more of a metaphor. And it's a metaphor reminding me of another famous Pope painting. And it's the painting by Bruegel of the landscape from the fall of Icarus. And if you look very carefully, and I'm looking very carefully, oh, here he is. Icarus likewise has plunged to earth. Now, Icarus, as you all know, was the chap that made wax wings and flew too near the sun and they melted, and he plummeted to Earth. But what is fascinating about this picture, and again, this isn't my idea, this is good old W.H. Auden's idea in his poem Musée de Beaux-Arts, that nobody notices what's happening. These people, the ploughman ploughs the field, the horse keeps walking, everything is normal, everything is natural. Nobody notices the remarkable event of the man with wax wings flying near the sun and his rather sort of sad demise by falling back to Earth. And if you could go back to the previous one, thank you, Maurice, there's a bit of that going on there, I feel, because so many pilots went to solitary deaths, unnoticed. However, an important question, and I think as I was looking at this and thinking about this, I was thinking, is this one of theirs or is this one of ours? Well, it shouldn't be a thought, but I think it is a thought. And I'd like to actually now have a look at one of ours. And there it is. And this aeroplane now comes into the story significantly, because we're back in early 1940 with the newly arrived Nashes from London. And we could find this little number, the Tiger Moth, in production at the Morris Cowley plant in Oxford. It was a trainer plane, and people learned to fly it. That's right, Morris, isn't it? Was it a
Trainer plane, yes.
Prince's trainer plane. And by that time, I'm getting into Morris territory here, so I'm sipping very carefully. Cowley had grown from a small village to become the centre of the Morris Motors car company. It had its own private airfield, and late in the 1930s became involved in aircraft manufacture, not unusual in those days. Now, William Morris worked with the de Havilland Company to make these trainer surveyor aircraft. There was some tension when the war broke out between Lord Beaverbrook, who was heading up military manufacturing, and Lord Nuffield, who owned the car park. And I'm going to got one or two quotes here from a very good book by a guy called Stuart Mackay, who wrote about the production of the Tiger Moth at that time. And he writes, running in parallel with military vehicle manufacture, the motor industry attempted to apply the same techniques to light aeroplane construction, and a sour atmosphere developed between the Morris management and the resident de Havilland technical representatives. They were both concerned about the quality of early aircraft. When it says tension, it understates it. The Havilland Company and the Cowley Company didn't really hold hands at all. The engineers were flexible, working on motor vehicle engineers sometimes, and also working on the aeroplanes as well. Another extract from Stuart Mackay's book. Engines, instruments, electrics, wheels, tyres and propellers were brought in and taken to their allotted places on airframes and assembled exclusively by female labour. Which brings me to this person. Here she is. This is Anstey Shaw. She was the daughter of a relative of Paul Nash called Nell Bethel. Moved to Oxford in the 1940s to join the there's another acronym coming up, everybody, so brace yourselves. The Women's Auxiliary Air Force, the WAF. So you must be careful, you must distinguish between the WAF and the WAC. Right? The WAC was the more women. Anyway, you can work it out yourself. But the WAF employed a lot of women to do quite a lot of the basic work on aeroplanes at Cowley. And civilians played a big part in keeping the aircraft in the air. From the start of the war, Britain was critically short of aircraft, and their quick repair after being damaged from combat was a key priority. The repair, this is really interesting, the repair, not so the other bits haven't been interesting, but this is even more interesting than the bits I've been already. The repair of a damaged aircraft was a third of the cost of producing a new one. So to actually fly an aeroplane in, have it repaired at Cowley, and fly it out again was actually saving a great deal of money. The government set up the Civilian Repair Organisation, CROW, whose job it was to organise in secret and repair and return these aircraft to service. So again, it was about keeping planes in the air. And the organiser of this was, of course, our local hero, Lord Nuffield. This photo was from the Nash family archive and was taken about 1942, I think. And Anstey Shaw was about 20 at the time. Now, Nash was beginning to hear about these aircraft and was growing ever more interested in them, particularly for a young man called Maurice Cardiff. And he and his wife had been staying at the Randolph when the Nashes first arrived. They shared lodgings with them in Beaumont Street. Cowley became the base for what's called the Civilian Salvage Group, because what was happening here was that some planes came in, could be repaired and fly off, some planes couldn't. And it was decided that what they needed to do was make sure that all planes ended up at Cowley. Because not only were there parts to be repaired and exchanged, but also if the plane couldn't fly, they could be cannibalised. And they could get from it that very precious material, aluminium. Now, I'm not going to go on too much about aluminium, because Maurice is a bit of an authority on aluminium. But the aluminium was central to the story of what happens next. Because planes that couldn't be recycled, planes that couldn't be got back up in the air, ended up in what was become known as the Cowley dumps. And here is Paul Nash actually sketching at the Cowley dumps. By 1940, the Battle of Britain was in full swing, and the Cowley dumps had become a very large site. The recycling part was called the #1 Metal and Produce Recovery. I think I'm going to give up on this. But its aim was to actually salvage anything it possibly could. And there's a recorded memory of someone who worked there. And I found this. It's been made in 2005 by the BBC's People's War Archive. And it's the testimony of a young girl, 19 years old, Doreen Hewitt, who was an apprentice chemist working in the metals laboratory. And this is a quote. This is what she said. In 1943, remember this is a 19-year-old girl, and she was interviewed in 2005, so she's in the 60s now. 70s, 60s? In 1943, I went to work at the laboratory at the #1 Metal and Produce Recovery at Cowley, remaining there until long after the war. The #1 was set up early in the war to salvage everything that could possibly be used from crashed aircraft. My father already worked for the maintenance unit, 50MU, also based at Cowley. Now this is good, which recovered aircraft from crash sites, the sorts of crash sites that Paul Nash had been painting. He was part of a loading gang using Queen Mary transporters, and these were huge flatback lorries, to bring back wrecks, again, to bring back wrecks of both German and British aircraft. This was then broken down, and the aluminium was used to be recycled because there was a great shortage in the war. And again, Doreen Hewitt talks about that place. Work in the factory was hot and stuffy, but not so hot as the foundry where the men worked, stripped to the waist. One man bore a very large scar on his back, caused by molten aluminium that splashed from the pot. She writes further. Often we worked from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. It was after 5 p.m. a high tea. If it was after 5 p.m. a high tea was delivered to us to eat in the laboratory. Sometimes social parties from the entertainment corps arrived and concerts were held in the canteen, which made a very welcome change from routine. I think it did. Anyway, this place, through Anstey Shaw and through various contacts he had, became known to Nash. He became interested in it, and he became fascinated by it and started making dozens and dozens and dozens of sketches of the area. And this is one of them. As he looked at the site of the landscape, I forgot to say, Nash also took a lot of photographs as well, so this obviously is a photograph. As he looked at the site of the landscape and the wreckage across it, he said, again, I think this is one of the most telling statements he made about Cowley. The thing looked to me suddenly like a great inundated sea. You might feel, under certain circumstances, a moonlit night, for instance. This is a vast tide moving across the fields, the breakers rearing up and crashing on the plain. And then, no, nothing moves. It is not water or even ice. It is something static and dead. From these images and from these imaginings, what he came to believe and what was produced has been described as one of the finest paintings actually produced during the Second World War. Totter's Mere, Dead Sea. Totter's Mere and Butler Britain re-establishes Nash's reputation as a war artist. They were both exhibited in 1942 to public acclaim, even though critics were somewhat reserved. It's a propaganda piece. Only German aircraft are shown. His health, however, began to deteriorate and he worked less. However, in 1942, he produced this picture. The subject is a Sunderland flying boat seeing off a U-boat. The title refers to England and the Englishness of William Blake, and we can see it as one of the most propagandist of his airline pictures. It lacked the subtlety of some of the early plane pictures, and critics were harsh. The Manchester Guardian described it as a failure in the grand manner. Not many other artists are ambitious enough to come up with a really spectacular cropper. At the same time, Nash decided to embrace propaganda wholeheartedly. It might have been a philosophical decision, or perhaps his deteriorating health affected his thought, but both. The work, he decided, would act as a counterbalance to the state German propaganda run by Joseph Goebbels, which seemed to have seduced a whole nation into fascism. It had also denigrated modern art. For Nash, as Kenneth Clark, this was the survival of civilization. In 1941, he wrote to Clark, "Where is our imagination? Have we no ideas? Nothing up our sleeve, or better still, can't something be found? And why not? Why not have a ministry of imaginative warfare?" What followed was the Führer collages. Okay, so here are the planes that we saw earlier manifest themselves in a more sort of obvious form. Despite his poor health and bouts of melancholia, he was determined to forge ahead with these follow the Führer collages. He imagined Nazi Germany as a predatory animal, and in this particular instance, an aerial shark looking to consume all it came up against. It's difficult to gauge the impact of this on the general public, so I know what perhaps some of you are thinking. It's easy to get the message, but the absurd nature of the image doesn't resonate with everybody. The Ministry of Information like their messages to be simple, but it harks back to the surrealist in Nash, which has always been a feature. surrealism turned up a notch, with a Hitler head multiplied into an army of screaming faces swarming across the landscape. Nash had become obsessed with Hitler and his horrible head, as he put it. He wrote, "You see, I believe Hitler to be the embodiment of evil, but his physical personality is an image at once terrible and absurd." Again, it's difficult to know what ordinary people made of this. But because he was no longer employed by the Air Ministry, he sent these straight to the Ministry of Information. His thoughts about them were recorded, and his mood was sombre. And he said in a sort of thoughtful way, "Although I know how terribly gay and decorative war in the air can look, I would like to give the feeling of dreadful fantasy that will get inside this business and frighten someone till they bust." For many in the Ministry of Education, oh my goodness, Freudian slip, Ministry of Information, this series was the straw that broke the camel's back. Money was tight. Excuse me. Money was tight. And the relationship between the Ministry of Information and WAC was fraught. Understanding artists and their art, tax civil servants, and propaganda seemed to be muddying the waters even more. In 1943, the Ministry of Education and the Treasury officials agreed that war artists are recorders, not propagandists. As such, their work seems to fall outside of the ministry altogether. This has always been recognised as far as written history of war goes. And we successfully resisted the attempt of the War Cabinet officers to saddle us with the responsibility of a film record of the war. Why should pictures be any different? For Nash, this was the end. He produced one last piece of war art, almost a postscript to the huge body of work that he had produced over 2 world wars. Unsurprisingly, it is surreal and imaginative. The theme is a night bombing raid over Germany. Nash got his ideas for this from records and photographs. The ground is being carpet bombed. White clouds and dust suggest explosions, billowing black smoke indicating destruction below. Green sky gives it a nightmare quality, suggestive of some of Nash's World War I pictures. Perhaps we are making a new world. Was irony intended here? It was his last war painting. Far too abstract for the Air Ministry, too contrary for the critics, and too puzzling even for his closest supporter, Kenneth Clark, who wrote of it, "Alas, I can't understand it. Even with your admirable text to enlighten me, I can only tell you truthfully my own feelings in front of it, which were apologetic bewilderment and incomprehension." This last piece is a piece that I put together for an article that I'm writing all this. And this is, I've got the end of the article, and I've got the beginning, a bit in the middle is a bit of a fudge, but this is how it's going to end up. Propaganda is defined thus: information of a biased or misleading nature used to promote a political cause or point of view. It's too easy a definition. Propaganda is a slippery fish. In the hands of cowboys in white hats, it focuses on honesty, virtue and heroism, and exposes evil. In the hands of the black hats, it misleads, distorts and corrupts. Nash's experience with the air industry was a turbulent one, but he wasn't alone in that. Despite this, he managed to produce some very great works, including perhaps the finest painting of the war. He did not live too long after the war, suffering from a severe attack of pneumonia in 1946 and dying later in July that year. If we take the view that some of his art was propaganda, and I think we must say in his defence that it's always been his propaganda, a personal propaganda, never a propaganda determined by the state. That's it. Thank you very much. Embarrassingly hasty exit now. Moving wraith-like through the assembled company. I'm sure you have. But I did say to Nick that I'd leave a little bit of time for questions if there were any, and this is where my eyes and ears comes in, because I don't hear questions that are sort of shouted at me. I'm a bit worried about taking this mic off here. So, if anybody's got a question, thank you, Boris.
Can I just say that was thanks, Pete. That was a brilliant talk, broad, rich, and really fascinating. And I'm sure there are lots of questions. I will nip down into the audience if you want to put some hands up. But I do have one question that came to me at half time. That was from the Maxted family, and that was regarding, I think Stanley Maxted was a war correspondent, and the question was the connection between war correspondents and artists themselves, both have been serving on the front lines. What connection, if any, was there, Pete, between war correspondents who reported the war with news reports and artists themselves?
Yeah, that's a fascinating question. It's one I have looked at a bit. War correspondents were obliged to say things as they saw them, but again, rather like whack, they were accountable. They wouldn't be able. There were certain parameters in which they were expected to operate, in the same way that the war artists were expected to operate within certain parameters. What you don't get in war correspondence and in war art are the horrors of war. And as we all know, I mean, if you see the images from that are very much prevalent these days, they were all sanitised versions. Excuse me. To a greater or lesser degree. And as in war art, as in war correspondence, it's not necessarily the stories that are told and that appear and are presented to the public, it's the ones that weren't told and the ones that actually happened that war artists weren't allowed to depict are probably the most fascinating. But of course, they're not part of the record.
They haven't got any questions. Yep.
You said that Nash moved to Oxford in 1939. When did he do all his stuff on Whitman clamps?
Ah. Well, fortunately, no. I do have an authority on that subject, so Chris, if I get this wrong, you just give me a nudge. But he painted the clumps at various times in his life. There are some very early depictions, and in his declining years, he lived down to Boars Hill and painted several images of that landscape. He had a very special thing about Britain Clumps. It's called his genius loci, the spirit of the place. And in fact, we got Chris here, who's actually written a book on the subject, so I'm not going to go on too much about it. But it's a fascinating topic, and he was a man that felt very strongly that places had a spirit, and they drew them back time and time again. And interestingly, Cowley, I think, and Morris and I are going to do something on this eventually, that Cowley Dumps was such a place. Tottersmere, that notion that he got of this metallic sea, which is a sort of remarkable image, drew him as strongly. But of course, there were so many other things going on. And so much of what I've been talking about is his personal response to the war. And I think you can trace it back to his personal response to the First War. I think there's a dovetailing there. He's a complicated man. He's not the sort of man that you find these days, I wouldn't think. But then again, you know, they were very particular to their times and their art.
Any more questions?
What is and where is the dump now, Cowley?
Well, I am going to let Morris talk about this because this is well, it's behind where the Cowley car plant was. If you actually look at Tottersmere, there's a range of hills in the background, and that is shot over. I mean, the thing was, it took up a huge area, and a lot of it straddled a railway line. Talk about the railway line, Morris.
The easiest way to think about where the dumps were, if you're going towards Liddell and you go under the railway bridge and you go down Transport Way, that is where Minoli tiles are. So essentially that was where the dumps were. So if you look at plans even now, and I've spoken to car workers there, part of the factory is still known as the MPRD. So the section really by the railway centre, by the railway station, and that was being used to bring, and remember as well, the railway at that point ran through Wheatley to Tame via horse path. So they were bringing in materials via the railways as well. So that's where the dumps were. Huge area, stretched more or less to horse path, divided up like Manhattan into a grid system, and the different areas of the dumps would have been given names like Spitfire Way, Hurricane Way, Wellington Way, and that would have separated out the scrap into the types of planes, so they could go and use the scrap that way. So yeah, but there's no real trace of it. I mean, it's a shame that the roads aren't even named after it. But
So it's all built over now?
it's all built. Yeah, it's all built. Any more questions?
Right, well, thank you very much for attending tonight. I enjoy this talk, and I hope you enjoy it. I just hope you enjoy it as much as I do.